Hi, this is David Wolinsky bringing you another interview from the audio archives of NoDon'tDie.com. This time I'm bringing to you the first half of my conversation with Tanya X, the creative director of Kitfox Games. She and I spoke on April 11th, 2015, and if you'd like to read a full transcript of this Q&A, you can click the link in the description below. Also down there you'll see a link to my Patreon where your support helps me continue on with this project. Thanks.
I'm Tanya Short, and I'm the creative director of Kitfox Games. I'm turning 32 soon, and I'm based in Montreal, Canada. I've played video games for most of my life, and I've been working in them on and off since 2003. So I'm in my 12th year, really.
So this is a weird question to ask first, but I've been toying with the idea of interviewing my mom for the site, who believes she is not a gamer, and she has strong opinions about what video games are and aren't. And so, given that you're a person who's played games your whole life, how do you explain what you do to your parents? And do they think that they're gamers? Like, what do they make of you spending your time this way?
For the first 10 years or so I was playing games, my mom was a little bit worried, but she reads a lot of books, and I think
Okay.
I was playing, I think it was a Final Fantasy game or something, like Final Fantasy 7 or 8 or something, and she kind of had this moment where she said, Tanya, these are kind of like books, right? you're kind of getting a story out of this. And once I was like, yeah, kind of, Mom. She was like, okay, I guess I can't really disapprove since I'm reading all the time. But the way I usually explain my job is I'm like a director of a movie, but for a game. So, I mean, it's the game designer is probably the hardest job to explain of all the jobs on a game project. It was easier when I was a level designer, because then I could actually explain that I was designing the world and placing the objects that make up the world, and that's kind of easier to imagine than creating game mechanics. But I mean, usually if people play games, they can kind of get it. Like my mother-in-law plays a lot of games. I mean, they're mostly casual games or puzzle games or hidden object games, but she plays a lot of them. And so when I say, somebody has to design, how many points you get for that, or what happens when you poke that at the wrong time or whatever, I mean, that it's pretty easy for her.
What do you feel like, do you think the same is true for the audience of games? Like, do they understand what a game designer does? Do they need to?
I think most don't. I think most still have the impression that a game designer kind of just comes up with ideas all day, and that's kind of it. And I don't think that's true of all people who play games. I think more and more it's to our benefit to educate our audience, because, I don't know, kind of like in film, how it is helpful for directors that their fans know how much money goes into films, and it helps them to know like what the process is, so that when something goes wrong, it doesn't just seem to come out of nowhere. So personally, I think it's great when people who play games, or even people who don't, have a better idea of what's going on in our industry and what our production processes are. I think it can only help us.
Yeah, I mean, that was something you said you wanted to talk about, was just talking about there being a need for more transparency of production practices, ideally also financials.
Yeah.
But you said that Hollywood's box office sales culture has its pros and cons. I would agree with you. I think the thing that stupefies me the most is that is reported as news.
Yeah. It's kind of strange. But I mean, at the same time,
go ahead.
So I guess I had this moment when I was when we just started Kitfox, and I was doing market research for the first time, because I'm not a marketer usually, but for Kitfox I have to be, because we're a small team. And we were making our first game for mobile first, and then we were developing for Steam and mobile, but we knew it would come out on mobile first. So I was researching the App Store and the Google Play Store and everything like that, and realizing how much those transparent, top-grossing games drives that industry. Like the fact that they basically have those box office sales equivalent means that everybody on mobile is striving very hard to emulate, or it's almost impossible not to be influenced by it because everyone's constantly talking about who's the top grossing, why are they the top grossing, what is it that makes them the top grossing, and that becomes a very depressing conversation when you realize that it's been the same game for 3 years now.
Well, what game has that been?
Clash of Clans. It has been at the top of the top grossing charts for years.
So do you think people are we focusing on the wrong things here?
Well, I mean, see, and that's easy to say, except that, I mean, Steam also has best-selling games. They have a list like that, but the culture is super different, and I think that the culture is kind of passed down from Valve through their development relations team in a very, very different way than the Apple or Google development relations team, which, I don't know, I get the sense they don't really care about games very much.
Who, Apple or
Apple
Google?
and Google, they...
Are you suggesting that Apple and Google has other things they're doing also?
Yeah, I just, they were never originally a game development company, so they feel like they have more important things to do.
But on the other hand, neither was Nintendo or Sony or Microsoft.
Yeah, this is true. It's true.
I'm not trying to disprove your point, but I'm just like, that's interesting though.
Well, I mean, Nintendo, they were making trading cards. It's close.
I think they started off. I thought they had like love hotels also. They have a whole other.
Really, I thought they were originally like collectible cards or something. Like they were back.
I think they also did cards at some point too. But at some point there were like, maybe it was later. They also expanded, or they also were involved. It's like part of their lore that's been buried through the years. But cards, yeah, I'll give you that.
But
okay,
I mean,
but the same is true of Microsoft and Sony.
It's just
for
clear
sure.
that when they decided to make consoles, suddenly their whole business had to shift to prioritize games. Whereas Apple and Google, I mean, they still don't see their phones as consoles. So I don't know. It's hard to say exactly why it is, but I know that even as the market on Steam gets saturated with lots and lots more developers, I still don't think it'll be driven by the top sales charts. That's just not how that ecosystem works.
And to your point, too, like something I've been thinking a lot about is just how and why have games gotten so devalued, like in the perception of them, mm-hmm. and like even what we're talking about here, like what is the top selling game? It's not like you go on Amazon to look for like a pair of slippers, and you're just like, well, what are most people getting? Like, it's not really the same experience, and I don't think you would do that with movies or books.
Well,
I mean,
totally do that with movies or books. I mean, I don't.
Maybe I don't.
For my movie,
but I think but I think it implies that like. I guess it is true for any medium.
I mean, if you were a slipper enthusiast, if like you identified,
I am.
If you loved slippers. Like you'd at least know what the most popular slipper is, even if you think you're better than that, right?
Yeah. I mean, well, I don't know that I am better than that, but I think this gets to an issue on my side of the aisle, which is game criticism and like what do people actually want from it? What is reasonable to expect from it? This isn't really on your list of things, but this feels germane to ask. Like, what do you think is lacking from game criticism right now to make it more useful? Sorry, it's kind of a broad question and kind of a big one.
It's pretty hard. I feel like we're on the right track. I feel like for many years, games criticism kind of floundered. But sites like Killscreen and Offworld now, I mean, there's a lot of really great criticism going on. And I think it's interesting to see, like, new critics like yourself, kind of both looking at new games that are coming out, but also realizing there's this huge back catalog of games that have all sorts of layers that no critic ever really explored.
Yeah.
So it's fun watching the dialogues kind of grow. I think a sense
of history is also kind of missing.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't have answers to these questions.
I mean, I guess I feel like there's an overwhelming sense of personal nostalgia instead of like a historically accurate archiving sense. I don't know. Like, I mean, there's that thing that came out this week where maybe archiving will be even harder. But it's famously difficult to actually get like a sense of the real history of video games, and and not have it be tainted by everyone shouting about Mario and Sonic and whatever.
I mean, there are like some studios doing interesting things with rights management. Like one I'm a big fan of is not Dive Kick, but something Kicks. In the transcript, I'll fix it. It didn't look exactly like I know what I'm talking about. But they're in Portland. They're in the Pacific Northwest. They're responsible for basically negotiating and handling the rights for older games so that they can get either remade or resold.
Oh, very cool.
And for me, I'm much more interested in that versus, say, an HD remake. But all this stuff is so subjective, and everyone has such strong opinions and ideas of, the way that things should be done, that I feel like some of the stuff is seldom explored, or they just set it down, like what we're seeing right now. It's just no, just leave it alone. That's the story you're talking about, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. To your previous point, I just tweeted this morning how I'm obsessed with new IP.
I think I retweeted it, but continue. So that people reading it.
I get so aggravated seeing how people cling to old IPs and are just obsessed with old IPs. And I understand that impulse, but I feel like our culture is just becoming this rock tumbler of IPs, and I don't know. I feel like it's really difficult, and this is part of the transparency of business and production as well. But I know that it's a business risk. I know, as the business developer of a studio that's trying to be profitable with a game that costs over, a couple $100,000, it would be a lot easier if I had a known IP, for sure. But I think it's really important to me and to Kitfox that it is new and that we're trying to invest in the future rather than withdraw from the past.
I mean, you get the feeling that, I get the feeling, that that no one really wants to be first.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of stuff is unfairly just sort of shoved onto the quote unquote indie space, which is okay, you guys do the new stuff.
Yeah.
And what I noted, and I also tweeted about, is very little of the things I saw about The Order or Bloodborne noted the fact that, holy shit, there's a new IP.
Yeah. And I thought that was really clever of them. It's really clever and really great that they get to simultaneously withdraw from a previous IP while also making a new one. And I think a lot of studios wouldn't even have bothered with the second step, but it's really clever of them.
On the other hand, Mortal Kombat's coming out next week. So, although, it looks fun and cool, and it's familiar and nostalgia. On the other hand, it's cool. I think we're getting a lot of that.
Yep.
We can talk about the current consoles if you want, but I'd be curious to talk about the things you want to talk about, and something else you wanted to talk about, which maybe is similar, which is you just want to see fewer copycat game designs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like you said, nobody wants to be first, and I don't know.
Is that true? Do you feel like there's also copycat game design across the entire?
Oh yeah, definitely everywhere you look.
Yeah,
I mean, and it's not because anybody's a bad person, and it's not because people aren't creative. It's almost like we've forgotten what creativity means. I don't know, when I was in high school, and I didn't even know that I really wanted to be a game designer yet, but I still had this little journal of game design ideas. They were mostly this one game, but with this character I made up. And I didn't think about it that way at the time. It was just kind of it was just natural. It was almost like game design fanfic. And I think that that's really common as a first step, that you're inspired by something so strongly that it's almost impossible to remember what life was like before it. And it takes a lot of self-discipline and critical thinking, and really, really questioning what you're doing to figure out whether what you're working on is actually a new idea or whether it's kind of an homage. And that's the extent of it. And there are worthwhile things to get out of being inspired by something else and taking a new direction or making homage. I'm not saying that there's not anything inherently wrong with that. I just mean people sometimes do it unintentionally. They think they're making something grand and new and wonderful, when in reality they never would have made that game 5 years ago.
or even could have.
Yeah.
What do you think is like the last grand revelatory game that you played? It doesn't have. I'm not talking about separating between AAA and whatever. Like those are terms I actually want to try to get away from. But like just objectively speaking, like what was the last time you were like, holy shit, I've never seen something like this before. This is
that
amazing.
happens. I get one of those like every week, but
I should talk to you more often.
No, I mean there's tons of great new games coming out. But people tend not to care unless they either make a lot of money, win a lot of awards, or somebody they really like is like championing it. It's hard. Like if you go on itch.io, you'll find a ton of cool new stuff. And like even something that was from a few years ago that was a really, really simple little experience. It was called Hug Punks. I think I don't want to.
You can Google. It's
yeah.
Okay.
Okay. It's by Merritt Kopas.
Oh, okay.
And I think she made it a couple of years ago. And it's the simplest little game, but I just love it so much. And it had been a while since I'd had any kind of experience like that, and I can't think of what game I would compare it to because it's just it's the length of a song, and like the tagline of the game is like get hugged, and you just run around like hugging people and cats, and it's just awesome. And
the only thing that makes me think of, and I'm going to check it out immediately after, is there was a PlayStation 1 game called Tulip.
Oh, I never got to play that one.
I think it's on digital now.
Is
you should check it out. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that's a kissing game, right?
It's a kissing RPG.
Yes. I remember I picked it up in the store and almost bought it, but I put it down and I never saw it again.
I stupidly imported it, and it's in a storage unit, and then I bought it on digital, and then that console is also in a different storage.
Yeah.
As tends to happen. But like I never know like. And I've done stuff like creatively, like myself, and I've taught other people how to do creative stuff, and I can never tell if people take it as a knock or if they get their backs up against the wall when you're like, oh, this thing reminds me of that other thing.
Yeah.
And you know what I mean? Like, do you feel like people in games are especially allergic to that, or?
No, I think any creator. Like I'm also part of a short fiction writing group. I write short fiction every month, and it's difficult the first few times to hear and realize, like, oh, this is influenced by this other I thought that I was working in a vacuum, but actually this does remind me of this other thing if I actually think about it. And it's hard because that's kind of the first impulse anyone will have, even with a completely new game.
Yeah.
Your first impulse is to relate it to something else, to put it in your kind of constellation of meaning. And I don't know, that kind of making relationships between art is healthy, but it makes it even harder to recognize if you're actually creating something new or not. But I guess, like, rather than being obsessed with whether or not your idea is new, I guess I just wish I talked to more creators who said that they pulled their game idea or their core concept from a passion that wasn't a different video game. You know what I mean? Like, like, I don't know. I don't mean to brag or anything, but part of why I'm really happy with Moon Hunters is that the primary inspiration wasn't in a game. It was in my own interest in mythology and kind of occult lore and like pre-biblical cults and things. And like that interest makes me very much more confident in Moon Hunters and why I think that it'll be a cool kind of unique game. Whereas the previous game, Shattered Planet, I mean, it was a great little game, but my original inspiration was kind of point blank the first few turns of Civilization. Like, it was like going through the darkness, like curiosity, and it turned out to be a super different game. It's nothing like the first few turns of Civilization at all. Like, I don't think anybody would actually make that connection playing it, but it kind of limits the scope of where your mind and your heart will go when you're working on the game.
I mean, for me, as someone in a teaching capacity or someone where they're like, hey, please look at my thing, teaching and critic capacity, I guess I would say, I always and only bring up things I would compare it to, and I do this as for my own stuff as well, as by way of example of things to learn from. Specifically, like, what are the mistakes you see them doing that you do not want to repeat?
Yeah.
What are the really awesome things you see them doing that you don't want to be accused of stealing? Or how do you want to improve? How do you want to improve upon that?
And it's hard because sometimes you see someone going down a road, and I play test a lot of other indies games and give them feedback, and you see them going down somewhere, and I almost don't know whether I should mention a game or not because like you said, like I don't want to like destroy their world of like. But you also don't want to influence them too early, like. But I want them to be aware that this other game exists, just in case.
But you don't want to be in that world where you are completely alone in a vacuum. That's terrifying, and there's no context for like what am I doing. But I see that so often in video games where it's like I am an artist, I'm unlike anyone else, and it's like, but you're actually being a little ignorant, a little bit. Which sounds harsh, but it's just like you're cutting yourself off from so much stuff you can learn from, and learn about yourself.
Yeah, I mean it's hard. Like I don't know, advice that writers are sometimes given. Like I've read a lot of advice for fiction writers, and one of the things you're supposed to do is not read in your genre when you're working on a longer work. Like if you're working in, I don't know, let's say you're writing a fantasy novella. You're supposed to not really read fantasy for a while you're working on it because the way the brain kind of feeds on that is a little bit distressing, whereas it can be a lot more inspiring if you start reading, I don't know, historical nonfiction or science fiction or whatever.
It's the same as games. I mean, I did an interview yesterday with Brenda Laurel, and we were talking about she has her students like go and do batteries of interviews, for example, for one game project, just talk to children who have math anxiety and use that as inspiration for a game rather than, to your point, go play Math Blasters.
Yeah, definitely. Games. Like already start out in a constructed box.
Yeah, it limits what you can do. And so I guess this is a natural segue to procedural generation, like which I got to very organically. But what interests you about it, and where do you think we're at with it, and where do you think it's going to take us?
Well, I was initially interested in it, like almost as a design problem. We had to make, at least 20 hours of interesting content, and we weren't sure how to do that with Shattered Planet other than procedural generation because we only had one designer, and we knew we wanted to make a system-driven game, so programmers were going to be busy with that. And so it initially really started as kind of a practical solution to a design and production problem. But the more we started working on it,
You okay?
Sorry.
No worries.
The more I realized that most of the people talking about procedural generation weren't talking about the design of it, they were talking about the implementation because it's a very programmer-friendly kind of topic. And I started looking into it. I wrote our like essays, articles about our level design, like trying to teach our algorithm how to be a level designer and think about things like the critical path and risk versus reward and things like that, because that's what my degree is in, is level design. But then, I mean, I saw where that algorithm had failed. It had a few serious problems. And we knew for Moon Hunters we wanted to make something a little bit more meaningful for each of the pieces of the level. And furthermore, we knew we were going to procedurally generate the world as well. And I started reading up on it a lot, and I came across the work of Michael Cook, who created the AI Angelina, who makes her own games. And so that was just so fascinating to me that I kind of entered this rabbit hole of just thinking about procedural generation most days now.
I fell down the rabbit hole, and my rabbit hole also included Michael Cook last year, where, before I knew I was going to be doing this site, I was, rooting around in my brain with the things I ended up alchemizing, becoming this site. But I was just wondering, like, why are there not new genres? Like, what's going on? Like, seriously. And I did an interview with someone else at GDC who insisted that we have found all the genres.
Oh, my goodness.
he had a lot of other really great, interesting things to say, and that's totally fine. I'm not judging his statement. I would posit that most mediums don't usually plateau when they're like 60 years in. I think his point was just like, well, think about movies. Like, there's action movies, blah, 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 blah. I don't think that's necessarily true, but I was interested in procedural generation because I was just wondering, like, can someone... It's so ridiculous, and I may have already told you this, but I was just wondering, like, is it possible for an algorithm to just create an entire game, not just a level, but just completely randomly create a game?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Angelina...
yeah, and that's where I ended up with Michael Cook. Yeah.
And interestingly, so I don't know if you saw A Rogue's Dream.
What's that?
So A Rogue's Dream, I think, is like an adapted, second version of Angelina that he's now shut down for reasons I'll explain shortly. But it would take a topic, and it would, or maybe it became Angelina eventually. I'm not really sure, but it would go on Google and Google image search, and it would just create like a simple 2D game using that topic that you gave them. Like, it would make up whatever enemies if it saw that there was like a conflict. It would make up like power-ups based on what things it thought were helpful to the topic you gave. So an example was it would give you a little text prompt. It would say like, I had a dream about, and then you put in whatever. And if you put in like Canada, you play as Captain America actually, and I think you are like picking up hockey and punching. I don't even know. It's just a silly little like platformer creation game basically, and it creates the random levels and it creates the rules of the game based on what it understands from the internet. The main problem with this algorithm was that it was extremely racist and homophobic based on the meanings that it found online. So if you put in almost anything, it would go online, and especially around the time of Gamergate was when I think he had released it. You just came up with horrible hate speech basically as part of the game. So yeah, that was an interesting experiment into AI, and AI is looking at humans and saying, oh, well, this is what this means.
I think it's more an interesting view into humanity than anything else.
Well, but as to your question of genre, I mean...
yeah, I was going to say, we could segue away from that, or we could explore that, but I
don't know, I just have so many thoughts.
Me too.
I mean, Minecraft was clearly not a genre until it suddenly was, so I think absolutely there will be new genres, and I think games are actually much more likely to continually create new genres for hundreds of years than film is, just because humans like interacting in new and different ways, and maybe genres will come in and out of fashion, or we can support more simultaneous genres than more passive media can.